doing by how many seats we can fill around this table.
It's going to take, I think, a little bit of time. There's been a lot of change to gear back up towards being well organized in all aspects. Oh, we are ready to go. Okay. Welcome to the Progressive Caucus of the legislature. It is Tuesday, March 10th, right? And we're just coming back from our town meeting day break. Today, we have guests with us from Progressive Party members joining us, as well as the executive director of the Progressive Party. And we are going to be doing an update on where we're at with Act 73 in the legislature. We'll go ahead and do a quick round of introductions. And then Colin Robinson from Vermont NEA is going to give us an update on a bill that is in House Commerce right now, H205, that pertains to teachers' ability to negotiate leaving their job for another job. So we'll talk about that first, and then we're going to turn it over to Steph Yu from Public Assets Institute and Colin Robinson from Vermont NEA to talk more about Act 73. So I'll go ahead and get started with introductions. I'm Representative Kate Logan. I'm the Progressive Minority Leader. I represent Chittenden 16, which is downtown Burlington and the Old North End. And I serve on the House Committee on Environment.
Representative Brian Sheena from Burlington, Chittenden 15. I'm on House Healthcare and the House Ethics Panel.
I'm Representative Chloe Tomlinson from Winooski, Chittenden 21, and I sit on the House Transportation Committee.
Okay. I'm Steph Yu from Public Assets.
Hey folks, Colin Robinson. I'm the political director at NEA.
My name's Ezra Wilson. I'm from Burlington.
Heather Thomas, Executive Director of the Progressive Party.
Paul Brochi from Wells.
Spoon Agave, I'm the chair of both the Brattleboro Town and Wyndham County Progressive Party committees.
Hey, thanks, Spoon. And then Courtney? Courtney Record, House Correspondence. Thank you so much. Okay. Let's go ahead and chat about where we're at with H205.
Sure. So H205 is a bill that has been worked on by various interested parties, including organizations representing business, labor, workers, to, as a matter of state policy, ban non-compete clauses for workers, basically saying it shall be illegal as a matter of state policy for employers to require workers to be compelled to sign non-compete clauses. And this is a good thing, right? And so Vermont NEA, along with the rest of labor organizations, as well as other organizations, through an umbrella group we work through called Working Vermont, which is a coalition of labor unions, have been helping to support this effort. In mid-February, Legislative Council, the lawyer for the legislatures, determined that there's a provision in state statute, Title 16, 1752A, that functions as a non-compete clause for all public school teachers. And therefore, it was recommended and added to the bill, H205, that as a matter of policy, all of 205 would apply to all workers, whether you're a firefighter, nurse, clerk at a store, or server at a restaurant, all workers in Vermont, but public school teachers. So this raises a fundamental problem. You know, if it's good enough for one worker, why is it good enough for every worker but public school teachers? 16 VSA 1752 is a section of statute that dates back to the 19th century, at a time when teachers, who are female-dominated profession, 75% of teachers then and now are female identified. And it was a time when if you were a teacher, you probably stopped teaching once you got married or became pregnant or had to ask permission to continue your vocation. There's massive discrepancies in pay by gender. And at that point, we've looked at some of old law books from the early 1900s, so the early 20th century, that 2 pages prior to this provision that is at issue now, it actually grants landowning women age 21 or older the right to vote in school budget votes. So this dates to a point in time that is not only anachronistic, but also just wrong. It also is unique in New England. No other state in New England has this specific carve out or language like this. In other states, just like if you're a firefighter or nurse providing a critical public safety to a community, serving your community, if you want to change jobs, you give requisite notice and you change jobs. Public school teachers don't have that. And by legislative council identifying it, it lifted up, quite frankly, something that we've been saying for a long time, that teachers, by virtue of 1752A, have essentially been functioning in a non-compete situation. Legislative council has now said, in fact, that is the case. And therefore, unless we want to change 1752A, we have to exempt the entirety of H205 from a right that would be available to public school teachers. So at this point, Representative Hedrick, Representative Gina's seatmate, has proposed an amendment that would strike this anachronistic piece of statute, 16 BSA 1752A, from the books. It is no longer relevant, is no longer needed. It's from a point in time when teaching was respected and looked at differently than it is now. And moreover, it would rectify the issue in a clear, clean, and simple way as identified by legislative council as being in violation or in conflict with the underlying premise of H205. So H205 came out of committee 11-0. Broad support in committee. And it only seems reasonable that if, as a matter of state policy, we're making non-compete clauses illegal, that same right should be conferred on all workers, not all workers, but public school teachers. So that's what Representative Hedrick's amendment is trying to address. The bill has been passed over on the floor several times in the past, the week prior to break, as well as this morning on the floor. And I think there's hope for some type of resolution. The reality is there's not really a middle ground on this. That's the problem. You can't sort of have a half non-compete clause for public school teachers. And so we'll see how this plays ahead. The school management associations stand firmly in believing that 1752A is a critical piece of statute. And unfortunately, we see it as anachronistic and unjust and also just you. So that's kind of where things stand.
I have a question. I don't know if you've spoken with folks in the committee yet about what the compromise might be, but I've heard that it would be potentially that this H205 would go into effect upon the next contract that's ratified for each local.
Mm-hmm.
So that there would just be a transition period.
Sure.
Since this wasn't something that needed to be on the table in collective bargaining in the past because it was a matter of statute.
Yes.
This would give opportunity for the locals and the school districts to bargain in their next contract over this specific issue, and that essentially 752A would continue to be in effect until the next contract is.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Because I think that's where we're going to end up.
Yeah. So as a general concept, without seeing specific language, because I haven't seen sort of anything specifically connected to what you're articulating, we do believe that it would be a subject of collective bargaining, and that's how it exists. And that even is referenced in H205, that local bargaining agreements between firefighters in a town, between nurses in a hospital, between whomever can be addressed at the bargaining table. So by default,
it's what is appropriate notice. something that's bargained.
Yeah. And so as a concept, that wouldn't necessarily be inconsistent with what's in H205 right now. And perhaps give folks time to sort of plan.
Yeah.
So that sounds on its face reasonable.
So, we're looking at banning non-compete agreements unless workers and employers decide they want that.
You know, I think there's a recognition that collective bargaining as a general concept allows a power dynamic where employers and employees can sit down and negotiate the terms and conditions of their employment. And if in the course of that, for let's say in a municipal fire setting, you know, the firefighters in Williston say, look, you know, we don't want to leave our firehouse empty. We're going to at the table negotiate some terms around notice. Not necessarily saying non-compete, but even saying you shall give 2 weeks notice, 4 weeks notice, whatever. That would be allowable in this type of situation.
But I mean, would it also be allowable for in negotiations for if the employer's like, look, we'll pay you extra, but you have to agree that for a year after leaving here, you won't work at any business like ours in the state. And we're giving the employees the right to say, sure, I'll sign that right away for that extra money. Right now, though, they can force it on the employee. They can say, in order to work here, you have to agree to that. We're saying, well, at least now the employee can negotiate that with the employer. But to me, there's not a big difference between those two things, because if you want the job, you would sign on. If you want, you know, I get it. It's a step in the right direction, but it's a little weird that we're banning it, but then allowing people to still negotiate it.
So,
you know,
what I would say, I actually, to be really honest with you, I would talk with either David Mickenberg, working in Vermont, or one of the other folks on committee to sort of understand that level of nuance, because I don't want to speak incorrectly to that. I do know there are some specific provisions around if you're a worker who makes over a certain amount, or if you're a very specific category of worker with like hyper.
And actually.
Yeah, it's like a 3-part test of like hyper proprietary knowledge.
Yeah.
well, you can't give away trade secrets, which is fair.
Right.
Like I get that stuff, but like it's just, and I support the idea. It's just, it seems like, and it's certainly not fair to carve teachers out from it. So like, I think that it's giving people a little bit more freedom, but it's still allowing them. I mean, people could still, for the right price, for the right price, people could still give it away. So at least they have the
Not for
power.
an individual employment contract, though. It would have to be under a collective bargaining agreement. So but we make other exceptions to employment law for collective bargaining agreements too, like.
I don't have a problem with it. I'm just
Yeah.
pointing out that I don't think it's that big of a deal. It's a good step in the right direction, but I don't
That's a
know.
good point.
We're still giving the employer the power to pressure the worker into accepting it for the right price. So I don't know why they're
Only
they're
under a
concerned about
collective bargaining agreement.
right, but that's still a big deal. And the employers still have a lot of power. So I don't know why they would resist this, why anyone would resist this is what I'm saying.
I have a question. What is the stated reason or logic for the exception to teachers?
So it really goes back to this statute that I was citing that dates to a point in time prior to collective bargaining. So in statute in the late 1800s, or throughout the first half of the 20th century, things around teacher compensation, other things were actually in statute and laid out in statute around dismissal, when folks can be laid off. And this particular provision actually says that a teacher can lose their license to teach which means actually their livelihood. The agency of education can take licensing action against them if they choose to sort of break a contract, break employment prior to point in time they previously agreed to. So it really is this vestige of statutory. I think it was genuine when it was probably passed. It was probably attempting to do something good in 1886, right? maybe not, I want to give folks a benefit of the doubt perhaps, but as a matter of policy now in 2026, it is not relevant or good anymore.
It's just tradition.
It's just, yeah.
So there is no,
Question, have you got any idea how often a penalty is invoked against a teacher who leaves their job before the contract ends?
So, there's been, as it relates to licensing action specifically, it's relatively limited. But what we know from talking to, our 13,000 members is there's a chilling effect, essentially. So you have a situation where a teacher working lives in Brattleboro and currently is working up in Springfield. And most teachers are told after town meeting that, okay, looks like you're going to have a job for next year. The school budget's passed. We have this many students. You're going to expect to have a job next year. And that's all outlined in the collective bargaining agreement, right? So they're told, okay, you can expect to have a job next year. And at that point, you tell the district, I expect to come back next year. Well, you work up in Springfield, you live down in Brattleboro. June 15th rolls around and oh my God, the dream job opens up at Academy School, 2 miles from your house, and you don't even apply because you know that if you do, your superintendent is going to talk to the superintendent, Springfield superintendent is going to talk to the Brattleboro superintendent and say, no, you can't have that. That happens all the time. So you don't even apply. So there's kind of a broad chilling effect that happens when it relates to teachers' ability to choose a professional path that might be both best for them as a professional as well as them and their family. And it doesn't exist. You go across the border over to Chesterfield or Keene or wherever, no similar law exists.
And you've been fighting this for decades.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a good opportunity to address this
Well,
finally.
and I think legislative council made it very clear, the point that we've been raising, quite frankly, for quite some time.
Yeah.
This is a unique
Yeah.
provision that functions as a non-compete clause for public school teachers.
Well, just what FYI, I believe you have support from Republicans
Yes.
and everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully we
Just want to
can.
I guess a smooth transition is,
Yeah.
I guess, the concern from some like the chair of the
Okay.
committee.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's.
So that's exciting.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
I know you want to talk about Act 73.
We do.
Steph is way more knowledgeable about all the underside of all of this than I am. I will just say the recent term I've been using is quagmire.
Yeah.
So
Really, we're moving ahead based on what I hear this morning, that there's the tech ed bill is going to come out of the Senate, and then there will be some changes made to it in the House, in-house commerce. And then everything else is going to be covered in the House Ed Committee bill.
it'll be interesting to see. The House Education Committee has spent a lot of time talking,
Yeah.
and it's hard to glean clarity from those conversations.
Yeah, and they're getting a crossover exception, so we won't have any clarity anytime soon.
Yeah.
On what is gonna come out of the House. So there's a lot of runway still for us.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, I was trying to not interrupt.
Yeah,
Winooski students.
Winooski students are here for
I
lunch.
told them I would meet them at 11:30, so I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Alrighty.
Do you have any sense of the timeline or they just have an exception, an open exception? Or, okay.
Great. When we're able to negotiate,
Sure.
not
Yeah.
us. But because I doubt that we'll want to support anything that's coming out of the House. I could be wrong. But yeah, don't know the timeline. I'm sure it'll probably be negotiated right up until the end of the session, I would imagine. And
Yeah.
there'll be some weird stuff happening on the Senate floor and it'll be chaotic and awful. That's what I'm anticipating.
At some point, you never know.
Yeah.
What's that?
Governor will pop in at some point.
Oh, yeah,
He's gonna pop in
absolutely.
and Muddy the waters.
Yeah, just to let us know that we're here until we get something done.
So anyways, I mentioned I have to pop to an 11:30 myself, but
I won't say anything.
Steph, you've heard my rap. Is there anything that,
I mean, I think that's the question is like, where do things stand now? That's
Right.
like the thing that keeps changing.
Yeah.
So everything else is kind of same old.
and I would say, and Steph can speak well to this, but keep your eye on the foundation formula because it's not being talked about a lot right now, but it
Okay.
really is. In some ways, at the end of the day, where lines are on a map for districts are highly impactful for communities. But what I would argue is more impactful is how much resources, money are available to communities to support their students. And does that materially do anything to provide property tax relief to folks while providing robust public education? And that isn't much of the conversation right now, but
Will that conversation primarily happen in Ways and Means?
Yeah, I think in terms of what's included in the foundation formula and how they decide the inflator, yes. And I mean, I think the pieces that are already in, and we can get to the pieces that are already in Act 73, assuming they move forward with or without maps, or they have some maps, then the homestead exemption thing kicks in, which if the second homes tax stays in, I mean, we can get into like the program.
Yeah.
or something,
Okay.
But, yeah, I mean, stuff is in motion.
Yeah.
So barring breaks.
Yep.
Things move forward, I guess.
and I've heard a lot of, well, we can't have updated analysis on the foundation formula until there are maps
Yeah.
because you need that to do the math.
Yeah.
Do you really?
Well, there's
Well,
huge differences.
yeah.
In what would happen, depending on what's included in the foundation formula and the size of the districts. Because if they're looking to create districts that have similar sized tax bases, it's a messy conversation. And is the tax base the residential tax base? Is the tax base the residential plus the non-residential tax base? There's a lot that could really change the modeling like crazy.
It seemed to me, my understanding was kind of the biggest question around the foundation formula, perhaps this session, is whether or not there would be a proposal to move forward with the foundation formula without making any changes to district consolidation. So that's been something I've been trying to track. I haven't heard much conversation about any tweaks to the formula itself, but rather when does the formula start and does it remain conditional on district consolidation or not, which would be pretty catastrophic for, I think, pretty much for most districts in different ways. And yeah, it would be pretty wonky. So.
I'll say goodbye.
Okay. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you so much.
You all.
So I don't know how much time you all have and what's the most useful to you. I have the long version, the short version. Is it helpful to kind of recap what's in Act 73? I know you all probably have a good sense.
Yeah.
You tell me what kind of time you have and what's useful to cover.
I mean, we have about 25 minutes
Okay.
till noon.
Okay. Well, I can give you, I kind of have a 15-minute version that I think gives some sense, our concerns about it, what it's doing, kind of the big picture of what the changes are. But again, I think the crux of the question is it foundation no matter what? In which case all these other changes happen, or is it contingent on consolidation and maps and then also what goes into the foundation, what doesn't. So let me take a step back and give you some kind of background on a lot of these things. And I hope, like I say, I'll try to keep it short and then leave room for whatever questions people have. I do always have charts. So let me make sure I have the right charts. See if you guys can see that. Okay. So really briefly, I want to talk about our concerns about Act 73, what's fair about our current system that we think is worth holding on to, if not expanding, and then what we would say are the tweaks that would make it even fairer than it is. But I want to start with something that I feel like has not been said out loud a lot in this conversation, which is that we don't think it's a bad thing that we spend a lot on public education. We're not saying we don't need to fix tax problems that are squeezing people, but to say that spending a lot on public education is a bad thing we do not accept that premise, right? We want to spend them wisely. There's places to improve always, and there should be good evaluation and accountability. But I think it should actually be a source of pride that we invest in our public education system. So I start from that perspective. But So public assets does a lot of work on budget and tax policy in the interest of interest of economic justice and making our tax system as fair as possible. And school taxes are one of those pieces that there's definitely ways to make them fair. But the big concerns we have about Act 73, first, it's anti-democratic. It's taking away local school boards. So whether it goes from 100 local school boards to 5 or 10 or 20, decimating local school boards, right? So from 900 school board members to maybe 25 in the state, huge difference. And it's taking away the right of communities to decide how much to spend on schools. And in the short term, I think, a lot of what happened last spring was, a lot of legislators ignoring calls from their constituents that had concerns about this bill. And I think that's still happening to some degree, right? So I think that's why the redistricting task force, which was supposed to draw the maps in the fall and supposed to make a plan for consolidation, went a different direction. And basically what they came back with was, we need a more cooperative model, we need a more community-driven model, and we need a longer timeline. There's plenty of places, potential mergers, absolutely, they're not off the table, regional comprehensive high schools, a more community-based cooperative effort over a longer time horizon, because this time horizon is bonkers, right? To merge districts to this extent, at this pace, is untenable. And they unearthed a lot of reasons why that's the case, and they heard from a lot of people. And just unearthed, I think, what is a lot of the complexity of the conversation around what's included in school funding, what Vermont includes in school funding that other states might not, what kind of social services are going through our school funding that are necessary and we can't just walk away from. So a lot of things came out of that committee that were really useful. The report is only 168 pages, but I highly recommend reading it, or AI summarizing it, whatever works for you, because there's a lot of really good information. But the second big concern we have is this: it's creating unnecessary chaos, right? Schools have been through enough. They're also under active funding threats and sort of policy whiplash at the federal level. And we've had a decade of state-imposed big reforms that haven't lived up to their promises, that haven't done what they said they were going to do. And so us adding to that chaos for no real good reason is the challenge. We can solve the tax problems without all of this. And that's the third thing, I think, that our big concern about Act 73 is that it's not solving the biggest problems that are facing schools and taxpayers. Biggest problems facing schools are these cost drivers that are out of their control, like healthcare for teachers and kids' mental health care. And then the unfairness of property taxes is not addressed in this bill. In fact, it's leaning into property taxes, and it means that low and middle income taxpayers will continue to subsidize high income Vermonters in the system. And I can show you sort of how that works. So just briefly, why we say we have the most equitable school tax system in the country. Again, recognizing that there are people who are being squeezed by their school taxes. But what we've done that no other state has done is that we've solved the problem of the difference between towns and their ability to raise property taxes. So unlike every other state, Vermonters pay the same rate for the same per pupil spending. You get the same amount out of the pot for the same tax rate, which is not true in any other state. So the wealth of your town is not determining how much you can spend on schools. So it used to be like a rich town could have a big pot because they raised the money, they could keep it local even with a low tax rate. And a small town with not a lot of property wealth would only have a tiny pot no matter how high their rate was. Now we pay the same rate, get the same amount of the pot because we have this one big pot that we all share. And if you look at that, the homestead piece or the residential piece, it's only 25% of the pot. So we're really pooling all of those other resources. And when you hear about sort of school tax bills, it's a small share of that pot, relatively speaking. The other thing I think that's fair, so you could have, the other thing that's fair about our system is that for most Vermont homeowners, their school taxes are based on their income, which is the best measure of their ability to pay, far better than their property value. But that income sensitivity has been allowed to get out of whack because those thresholds in red, haven't been updated in decades. So nobody remembers the last time that 47,000 was touched. That's been in place since at least the mid-90s, probably earlier. And those property values have actually been lowered to get more school taxes out of low and moderate income Vermonters, right? So those thresholds are a big part of the problem and why people are being squeezed. But it's not a system design flaw, right? This is a maintenance problem. We could update these tomorrow and fix that problem. It doesn't require communities giving up control to the state. It doesn't require closing schools. or slashing school spending, right? It doesn't require kind of creating all this chaos. And I think even more importantly, these problems would be in place no matter what happens to spending. We can cut spending, we still have these problems. Then, whether spending goes up or down doesn't affect whether these problems persist. And it's because property taxes are inherently problematic. So your income goes up by $1, your school tax bill could double under the current system. So property taxes are inherently regressive. It's only because of income sensitivity that they're not worse than they are. And here's another way to look at it. You can see it peaks in the middle, right? The middle income people are paying the biggest share of their income. And this is just the average. It's even worse for those people who hit those thresholds. So you've got people paying 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% of their income in school taxes when they cross one of those thresholds. And then at the high income end, as low as 0.5% of their income. So property taxes are regressive. That's a big part of the problem. And they overstate most people's ability to pay, right? Most people who are homeowners, their net worth is still below their primary home value because they don't own their whole home, right? They have a mortgage. So only a piece of it so they're being assessed taxes on more than 100% of what they're worth. Whereas at the high end, their primary home is just a small slice of their net worth. And so at neither end is it a good reflection of your ability to pay. And the problem is, especially in the last 5 years, we've seen property values grow so much faster than income that your ability to keep up with your property tax bill is part of the problem. And so they're disconnected and they're growing much faster. Property values have been growing much faster than income. And I think one of the big issues with the Act 73 is that it's not differentiating between those people kind of already getting a big break on the high end and the people who need the relief the most, who are paying the most and being squeezed the most. Instead, all of the solutions are like, let's just throw a little money into the pot and give everybody a little break, as opposed to recognizing that there are some people who are getting squeezed much harder. So I'll try to run through this stuff quickly and then kind of give you the sense of what's in Act 73. I'm looking at the clock here. So education spending has been flat, even flat adjusted for inflation, even flatter than all other state spending. But we have had some actual increases, especially in 24 and 25. They leveled off a little bit in the budgets we just voted on and in FY26. But what drove those increases were these cost drivers outside of schools' control. So teacher healthcare, kids' mental health needs. And you can see this is just the cost of healthcare in the Ed Fund, growing 3 times as fast as all of the other costs in the Ed Fund, right? And the demand for mental health services for kids quadrupling in some places, right? And it really varies depending on the part of the state that you're in. If you're in Chittenden County, you can contract for services. If you're in a rural part of the state, you might have to hire a full-time person. So there's a real range of how those are hitting, even though demand for kids' mental health care services is going up everywhere. So Act 73, let me try to cover that quickly. First of all, I think it's worth saying that this is being hailed as this transformation effort, but none of these ideas are new, right? A lot of them have been tried before and failed, or, there's sort of another angle on the same idea. We've been on this consolidation, not get ahead of myself. We've been on this consolidation saves money and is better for kids merry-go-round for a while now, and we don't have a lot to show for it. Act 46 has been around for a decade and didn't accomplish what it said it was going to accomplish. And also, and really did more harm than good, I would say, on the whole. We also had Act 173 of 2018, which was supposed to reduce special ed funding and still improve outcomes for kids. Still seeing those numbers go up, the amount we're spending on special ed, largely because there's increased demand for services for kids. Again, and then Act 127, which was a big part of the confusion in FY25 and kind of the issues with the tax bills, because it was the pupil weighting bill that fully went into effect in FY25. It changed everything about how we calculate tax rates. So it changed how we counted pupils and it changed how we calculate property value. So to get to per pupil spending, changed everything, changed how your tax bill showed up. side note, on our website at publicassets.org, we have town-to-town maps where you can look at your town. And I think the most interesting thing, we do this every year where you can compare your your school tax rates over time and also your spending over time. But because FY25 was such a screwy year, we also included the number of pupils you have. Because basically what the state did was they changed the definition of poverty to include a lot more kids, which is probably a good thing. But that meant that every district had way more kids than they had in FY24. So everybody's per pupil spending kind of went down. And then, so all the calculations are sort of apples to oranges before and after FY25. And it didn't hit all towns the same, which was part of why there was a lot of this chaos in FY25. So Act 73, wrong direction in a lot of ways. As I said, the redistricting task force recommended this more cooperative approach. And now this big question in front of the legislature is maps or no maps, move forward with foundation and all the other changes without the maps. That's sort of where we are now, is trying to figure this out. But I think a note on foundation. So back to foundation, which is what we had before 1997 and what most other states already have. And in other states, the foundation really is, it tends to be the ceiling for poor towns and the floor for rich towns in other states. So in other words, it's kind of the bare minimum of what the state says you need. And then rich towns are able to raise as much as they want above that. And then that's all poor towns can spend. Act 73 is trying to do a little to kind of manage that down, just so that those disparities don't get as crazy as they were before 1997. But it's really a one-size-fits-all approach that kind of ignores the nuance of different school budgets. And it's really a power grab for Montpelier. It's for Montpelier to control how much we spend on spending. And it's been very clear from this administration that the goal of that is to spend less on public education, right? And I think what they're trying to do is make the connection that the only way we can reduce your tax bill is to spend less on public education, as opposed to actually addressing the issues that make the tax bills unfair and squeeze some people more than others. A couple other things in the bill. One of the big ways that they're changing, I think I said they're leaning into property taxes as or property value as the means for your bill instead of income. So they're getting away from this income-based system that we have. And it gives you the sense, right? So we do have these cliffs in our current system, especially at the 90,000, you hit a big cliff, your bill can go up quite a lot, but you still see this regressive tail, right? The further out you go in income, the lower your bill. Under the proposed system, which is a homestead exemption system in Act 73, again, all of these changes are tied to consolidation, but they could be divorced from consolidation and move forward either way. And that's part of the question now. So under the new system, it's really, the tail is the same. The high income tail is the same. And we're really just talking about shuffling taxes around among the low and moderate income people. There'll be winners and losers among the low and moderate income people. Because what happens is your property value will decide your tax bill. So two people with the same income, somebody who's in Chittenden County whose home value has gone up a lot more than somebody in, I don't know, Newport, right? Like they'll have very different tax bills, which isn't true now. So it's a big shift away from income-based and leaning into property. And we have a lot of concerns because it's really the property tax piece that causes the unpredictability, that frustrates people because your tax bill can jump up much higher than your spending increases. And I think that's a big source of the frustration for people. Some good things in Act 73, second home tax, which I think could be preserved. So taxing second homes at a higher rate. And using that money to kind of just help support other things in the fund. Some limits on the use of vouchers. There's sort of a compromise. There are people who wanted to limit vouchers even more and people who want to expand them even more, and sort of landed on kind of more or less the status quo, like not letting them expand, but keeping them the same. So a lot of information there. I think I can spend a minute saying what we would say our priorities are going forward, if that's useful, and then use whatever time's left for questions. So there are some bills, both in the House and the Senate, that are trying to repeal the bad parts of Act 73 and keep some of the good things. We want the fair part of the system in terms of basing school taxes on income. We want to preserve that. So instead of moving more toward a property tax, can we at least keep income sensitivity, if not expand and update income sensitivity? I think that would be huge. I think any relief for taxes, whether short-term or long-term, is not just throw money in the pot and give everybody a break, but really let's distinguish between the people who are being squeezed the most, paying the most now, and not the people who are already paying the 0.5% and give them an additional break. It doesn't make sense from my perspective. Two other quick things is that the Agency of Education used to be a much more robust agency that's provided a lot more support, evaluation to school districts. It hasn't been that a long time because they've really slashed staffing there. And, maybe because that's not the priority of this administration. But I will say, they need to do a better job of knowing what districts need. This sort of one size fits all kind of blunt axe solution of foundation and Montpelier deciding is really abdicating the responsibility to understand which districts need what. And then the last thing I'll say, and I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, is there's so much going on at the federal level, all of which will come back on schools, right? It's not just the threats to school funding, but the increased immigration enforcement, increased and lawless immigration enforcement, the cuts to food assistance and housing assistance and healthcare, all of that stuff, those issues get absorbed by the schools. So I think, we have to have a really good reason to impose more chaos on schools at a time when they're sort of dealing with all of these other threats from all of these places. And again, I sort of come back to, it's a good thing to invest in public education, not a bad thing. We can solve the tax problems without slashing spending on public schools. Hopefully that's helpful. Happy to, there's always more slides than I ever get to, but happy to.
This is incredibly helpful stuff. Thank you. I
Yeah.
always really appreciate public assets data and offering insights into understanding more about sort of equity issues related to our tax system. And I don't know if folks have any questions.
Well, it jars some ideas and questions to me. The most glaring one to me is is about the value of education, and that of course is wherein the issue lies. And so I wonder, is there any vehicle for change regarding that? In other words, is there any vehicle to law-wise create a declaration, somehow change the value of education? Basically what you're saying, and this whole discrepancy in the bill is about the value of education, because so my question is, like, where could this be more defined, so that and perhaps promoted or just put out there, that because that seems to me to be the basis of the problem. I mean, because on the far side, I know many Republicans, and I've heard this, that from individual homeowners say, like, well, I don't have kids in school. Why am I, right? That's one of the big arguments.
Right.
So.
It's a great question. I mean, I think it is the only service that we really explicitly name in the Vermont Constitution as being like the obligation of the state. This is the main thing that the state does. This is what we spend the most state dollars on. This is our biggest investment. And it's been pretty steady state. That adjusted for inflation flat line. We've been investing about the same share in education for a very long time. And we've actually seen it adjust for declining enrollment. I know that's another argument you hear a lot. Well, it's declining enrollment, so obviously it should cost a lot less, right? We do see the teacher-student ratio staying the same. We do see, numbers coming down, but we're putting more social services into our ed fund too, because there's more need and because we're neglecting those areas in all the other parts of the state budget. So I agree with you. I think the Brigham decision says it really well, right? Like, I think there's two ideas in the Brigham decision that I always come back to, which is you need a robust public education system for a healthy democracy. You want educated population for a strong democracy. So like, keep coming back to that. And then the other piece of the Brigham decision that I come back to is, and every kid should have access to the same resources. Again, not to say everybody needs the exact same amount in every district, but that's why we have a shared pot, is because we're all responsible for all Vermont's kids, and we're putting that money, in the same pot.
And that Brigham decision was the 1997 Vermont Supreme Court decision that ruled that the foundation formula didn't sufficiently meet the requirements in the Vermont Constitution for substantially equal educational opportunity. And that's why we shifted away from the foundation formula.
I'd like to weigh in on this because I've got a pretty long history in education. Starting when I was a kid, my father was a teacher. He was also the chief negotiator of a large union where he was. So that was in the 60s, Albert Shanker, when all the organizing was happening. So I got a pretty good history of all these things. And I served on the school board some years back in Brattleboro. And it was very obvious. I think one of my first meetings on the school board, I asked sort of a rhetorical question. I think Trump was running for president and was looking like he was going to win. Got maybe 16 something. And I asked, does it seem to everybody in this room that we have an educated population in this country? Well, that was not a fit topic for what was happening right then. I just wanted to have that out there. It is absolutely true. I couldn't concur more that you cannot have a democracy without an educated population, because you can't have a democracy. You can't have anything really without an informed vote. And this, what I won't go into this, ties into this whole thing about the voting systems, representatives and secret ballots and all that. But so you can start with that idea. You need an informed vote. So now it begins to come down, not a question of how important it is education, but what are we teaching? Who is control? It's no accident that there is far too little interest in sustainability, even though it would seem there could be nothing in the world more important. And that's because that education, along with civics and democracy and stuff like that, hardly exists. It's grown a little bit, but it's still in the background. Just a little historical note. There was more of this in the past, never enough, because you go back to, I think, 1903, one of the leading voices in this country, the first John D. Rockefeller, the guy who was richest in the world, whatever he said was news. And one of the things he said was, America does not need I don't know exactly, but essentially said, America does not need a nation of educated people. It needs a nation of workers.
Right.
And that has been the thrust of education all along, is to produce labor for the owners of business and industry. And that really got set 1957. Russia put Sputnik in space before we did. And there was almost an on-the-dime pivot across this country from the humanities to STEM.
Right.
And everything has been directed towards technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And through that process, nobody ever talking about the consequences of our technology. But I'm beginning to digress there.
Well, and I'd ask, it's noon, and so we need to wrap up.
Oh, okay.
So if you would like to make the final statement of the caucus.
Okay, well, it's
Go
just
ahead and wrap us up right now.
for well, the sad note is the NEA is one of the most pathetically weak unions I've ever seen in my life here in this state. Well, no, it's not the worst of my life. I've seen some worse, but it's sad. The teachers themselves seem to feel, well, they haven't gotten much education either, but they seem to feel they're not a part of the equation. They're just there to do what they're told to do. And they're teaching curriculums that the schools are buying from corporations like Pierce, what's the name of it? Peabody, I don't know. Pearson. The whole thing is a mess and somehow, so you're right. I mean, the loss of local control, although local control didn't address this much either.
Yeah.
All right.
You could argue that,
Yeah, I'm done.
one of the benefits of larger school districts would be, consolidated power of the labor unions. There would be, larger bargaining, units. And so therefore, potentially the, more leverage by unions. So if we got to be positive,
All right.
yeah, but we do need to wrap up.
Yeah, a positive recommendation for the legislators.
Hmm.
Perhaps someday forming some kind of, what do you call it, a study group, a task force or something about education to determine the questions of what should our children be taught?
Oh, yeah. Well, that is something that we cede to local school districts right now. We don't.
Well, that's not going anywhere. That's a non-starter.
I mean, the quality standards come up and I think
Yeah.
we tend to stay in the lane of how we pay for it, but there's definitely room for input, right? And I hear that. And I think the answer is more community input, not less, even if it's not always going in the right direction.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it's me.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I also think, the educational needs of a small school district aren't fundamentally different than a different school district. I think there are some unique things from one school district to the next, but I can understand why people would feel like it might be, there could be better uses of our time. Like we could do things at a larger scale, some things at a larger scale, and it would still probably, with the right amount of input, the right structure, it would still be very equitable, still be a very equitable process, but we're just not even having like a good, reasonable conversation that's like very reflective or in at any significant depth on any single issue that we're discussing in Act 73, the entire thing. It's really difficult to understand the rationale behind this bill, except, yeah, it's really hard for me to understand the rationale behind the bill. Not going to solve any of the problems it says it sets out to do.
The task force tried. I think.
I agree. I think their report
and there
was
was
great.
effort in there. And the other thing I'll say is like, we're part of a New England consortium working on school issues, and these themes keep coming up in every state.
Yes.
This is a playbook that is being used everywhere. These kind of bashing, like the arguments against public education, the argument for funding, the getting people worked up about their tax bill, all of this stuff is playing out in every state.
Yeah, and it's
And
a push
so-
towards privatization of our school system. So that's where I say, like, none of this makes sense. What's really happening here? And it is like Koch brothers funded effort to privatize our school system. And Vermont is a target for the right wing right now. And we're falling for it.
Here's another
Real fast.
possibility to go after. Can it ever be demonstrated that a child who went to a small elementary school, which I'll just say for argument's sake, under 72 kids, could you do a survey to see if any of those students' lives turned out to be any less satisfying than students who went to a big school?
Well, actually, in Chloe's bill, didn't there end up being a study on
class
sizes? And I
Yeah,
get that,
not
that's the
necessarily
underlying question there.
similar.
Yeah, somewhat.
If
But
only we
yeah,
hadn't eliminated the
speaking of-
National Center for Education Statistics.
Yeah, speaking of school children, I have a lunch date with Winooski School
Yeah, me
District
too.
students right now, so we have to close out. Thanks so much.